The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the converted warehouse that housed Elite Combat Training Academy, casting harsh shadows across the blue mats that covered nearly every inch of the concrete floor. Sarah Mitchell stepped through the heavy steel door, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and immediately felt the weight of 20 pairs of eyes turning toward her. The conversations that had been echoing through the cavernous space moments before died to whispers, then to complete silence. She had expected this reaction. In her 8 years as a Navy SEAL, Sarah had grown accustomed to being the only woman in rooms full of men who believed she didn't belong there. What she hadn't expected was the particular brand of hostility that seemed to radiate from this group of mixed martial arts enthusiasts and weekend warriors who populated this civilian training facility. The academy had been recommended to her by her commanding officer as one of the best places to maintain her hand-to-hand combat skills during her brief shore leave. Located just outside San Diego, it attracted former military personnel, professional fighters, and serious martial artists who wanted to test themselves against high-level competition. The facility boasted state-of-the-art equipment, experienced instructors, and a reputation for producing fighters who could handle themselves in real-world situations. Sarah set her bag down near a row of lockers and began changing into her training gear. She could hear the whispered conversations starting up again behind her, catching fragments of words that she had heard countless times before. What's she doing here? Probably some rich girl playing soldier. This isn't a fitness class. Someone's gonna get hurt. She pulled on her compression shorts and athletic shirt, then laced up her grappling shoes with practiced efficiency. Her movements were economical and precise, the result of years of training that had stripped away any unnecessary motion. At 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighing 135 pounds, Sarah knew she didn't look particularly intimidating. Her shoulder-length brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face bore only the faintest traces of the sun and salt exposure that came with years of maritime operations. What wasn't immediately visible was the dense muscle that lay beneath her seemingly modest frame, or the calluses on her hands that spoke to thousands of hours spent rappelling, climbing, and grappling. Her shoulders and back carried the kind of functional strength that came from hauling gear up cliff faces and swimming through rough seas with full combat loads. Her legs had the explosive power developed through years of running in soft sand while carrying weights that would challenge much larger men. The academy's owner, Mike Rodriguez, approached as she finished getting ready. A former Marine Corps drill instructor turned successful gym entrepreneur, Mike had built his business on creating an environment where serious fighters could push themselves without the politics and drama that plagued many commercial gyms. He was a short, stocky man with graying hair and arms that looked like they had been carved from oak. And he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had earned respect through years of proving himself against increasingly difficult opponents. "You must be Mitchell," he said, extending a hand that felt like shaking hands with a steel cable. "Got the call from Commander Harrison yesterday. Said you were one of his best and needed a place to keep sharp while you're on leave." Sarah nodded, appreciating the direct approach. "Yes, sir. Looking forward to working with your people." Mike's eyes swept the room, taking in the clusters of men who were trying to look like they weren't paying attention to the conversation. "Most of these guys are good people," he said quietly. "But we get our share of tough guys who think they've got something to prove. You run into any problems, you let me know." "Appreciated," Sarah replied. "But I'm sure it'll be fine." Mike studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right then. Jimmy's running the grappling class today. He's solid, former collegiate wrestler, knows his stuff. Class starts in 10 minutes. As Mike walked away, Sarah began her warm-up routine. She started with basic mobility work, rotating her shoulders and hips through their full range of motion. Her movements were fluid and controlled, each stretch held for exactly the right amount of time to prepare her muscles without depleting her energy reserves. She had learned long ago that proper preparation was often the difference between success and failure, whether in training or in combat. The other students gradually made their way onto the mats, and Sarah found herself being sized up by each new arrival. She recognized the look. It was the same assessment that happened in every new environment, as people tried to figure out where she fit in the hierarchy and whether she posed any kind of threat to their own status in the group. There was Brad Kowalski, a thick-necked former college football player who now worked construction and spent his evenings trying to recapture the glory of his athletic youth. He had the kind of aggressive energy that came from someone who had once been the biggest and strongest person in most rooms and hadn't yet adjusted to a world where that was no longer automatically the case. Next to him stood Marcus Chun, a software engineer who had discovered Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu 3 years earlier and attacked it with the same obsessive intensity he brought to debugging code. He was technically proficient, but lacked the kind of practical experience that came from situations where the stakes were higher than points on a scoreboard. Tommy Ricci rounded out the group of regular students. A former Army infantry soldier who had done 2 tours in Afghanistan. He possessed legitimate combat experience, but had developed an attitude problem after his discharge that manifested as a need to prove his toughness to anyone who would pay attention. He had been training at the academy for 6 months and had established himself as the unofficial enforcer of the gym's informal hierarchy. Jimmy Martinez, the instructor, called the class to order with a sharp whistle. A compact man in his early 30s, he moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to use leverage and technique to overcome larger, stronger opponents. His wrestling background showed in his stance and in the way he seemed to be constantly evaluating angles and distances. "All right, people," Jimmy announced. "We're going to start with some basic takedown drills, then move into positional sparring. Partner up, and we'll begin with double leg setups." The pairing process happened naturally, with regular training partners gravitating toward each other. Sarah found herself standing alone as the groupings formed, which didn't surprise her. She had been through this dance many times before. "Mitchell," Jimmy called out, "you're with Chin today. Marcus, show her how we do things around here." Marcus approached with a neutral expression, which Sarah appreciated. He wasn't trying to be overly friendly, but he also wasn't radiating the kind of hostility she was getting from some of the others. "You done much grappling?" he asked as they found space on the mats. "Some," Sarah replied. It was her standard answer when people asked about her experience. The truth was more complicated. Her hand-to-hand combat training had been extensive and ongoing, but it focused on techniques designed to quickly incapacitate opponents rather than the sport-oriented approach taught in most civilian gyms. She had learned to kill or disable enemies, not to score points or achieve submissions for the sake of technical mastery. They began working through the drill sequence that Jimmy demonstrated. The double leg takedown was a fundamental technique, dropping low, driving forward with the legs while securing both of the opponent's legs, then following through to put them on the ground. It was simple in concept, but required precise timing and body mechanics to execute effectively against a resisting opponent. Sarah moved through the drill with obvious competence, her muscle memory taking over as she practiced the familiar motions. Her level changes were smooth and explosive. Her penetration steps carried her deep enough to secure proper position, and her follow-through demonstrated an understanding of how to maintain control throughout the entire sequence. Marcus noticed immediately that her technique was cleaner than most new students, but what really caught his attention was her timing. She seemed to understand instinctively when to commit to the takedown, reading subtle shifts in his balance and weight distribution that less experienced grapplers would miss entirely. "You said some," Marcus commented as they reset for another repetition. "This doesn't look like some to me." Sarah shrugged. "I've had good instruction." They continued working through the progression, and Marcus found himself having to focus more than usual to avoid being taken down when it was Sarah's turn to attack. There was something different about the way she moved, a kind of purposeful intensity that spoke to training under pressure. Most people learning takedowns in a gym setting approach them as technical exercises, breaking them down into component parts and building them back up slowly. Sarah attacked each repetition like it was a real fight, even while maintaining perfect control and safety. Across the mats, Brad Kowalski was working with Tommy Ricci, but both men were paying more attention to Sarah than to their own drilling. Brad had been coming to the academy for almost a year and had established himself as one of the stronger grapplers in the intermediate classes. His size and athletic background gave him natural advantages that he had learned to leverage effectively, and He enjoyed the respect that came with being someone that newer students looked up to. Watching Sarah work, he felt a familiar irritation building. He had seen her type before. Women who came into male-dominated spaces and expected to be treated with special consideration, who wanted the benefits of training with serious athletes without accepting the consequences that came with it. In his experience, they usually lasted a few weeks before the reality of the physical demands drove them away. "Thinks she's hot stuff," he muttered to Tommy during a break between drilling repetitions. Tommy nodded, his own attention focused on Sarah's technical execution. As a former soldier, he could recognize legitimate training when he saw it, but his ego couldn't accept that a woman might possess skills that rivaled his own. He had built his identity around being a warrior, someone who had faced real danger and emerged victorious. The idea that a female might have experienced the same crucible and emerged even stronger threatened his sense of self in ways he couldn't articulate. "We'll see how she does when things get serious," Tommy replied. "Drilling's one thing. Rolling's something else entirely." The drilling portion of the class continued for another 20 minutes, with Jimmy taking the students through increasingly complex variations of the basic takedown. Sarah rotated through several different partners, and each one came away with the same impression. Her technique was solid, her timing was excellent, and there was something about her intensity that was different from what they were used to seeing in the gym. When the drilling portion ended, Jimmy gathered the class in the center of the mats. "All right, we're going to finish up with some positional sparring. We'll start in the standing position, work for takedowns, and then continue on the ground for about 3 minutes per round. Remember, this isn't a tournament. We're here to learn and get better, so control your intensity and take care of your training partners." The speech was one that Jimmy gave before every sparring session, but Sarah noticed that several of the students seemed to be looking at her while he spoke. She had been through enough similar situations to recognize the signs. Someone was planning to test her, probably sooner rather than later. The first round of sparring began, and Sarah found herself paired with Marcus again. They slapped hands and began circling each other, both looking for openings to attack. Marcus came forward with a cautious collar tie, testing Sarah's reactions and trying to feel out her defensive posture. Sarah responded by immediately changing levels and shooting for a single-leg takedown, her timing so quick and her execution so clean that Marcus barely had time to react. She secured his leg, drove forward with perfect technique, and put him on the ground in less than 3 seconds. The takedown was so smooth and effortless that it took a moment for the implications to register with the other students. This wasn't a lucky shot or a technique that had worked because of surprise. It was the kind of high-level execution that spoke to thousands of hours of practice against fully resisting opponents. Marcus found himself on his back, with Sarah controlling him from the top position with a pressure and intensity that felt completely different from what he was used to experiencing during training. She wasn't trying to hurt him, but there was no doubt about who was in control of the situation. They continued sparring for the remainder of the round, and Marcus quickly discovered that his technical knowledge meant very little against someone who combined equal technical skill with superior physical conditioning and tactical awareness. Sarah moved with a kind of economy that suggested every motion had been tested under stress, and her transitions between positions were so smooth that he often found himself in bad situations without understanding how he had gotten there. When the round ended, Marcus sat up with a new understanding of who he had been training with. "Military?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, but didn't elaborate. The second round paired her with one of the academy's regular intermediate students, a young man named Dave, who had been training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for about 2 years. He approached the sparring session with confidence, having watched Sarah's first round, and convinced himself that Marcus had simply made mistakes that he wouldn't repeat. That confidence lasted approximately 30 seconds. Sarah used a simple arm drag to get behind him, secured a rear body lock, and took him down with a technique that was so fundamental that Dave had drilled it hundreds of times. The difference was in the execution, where most people relied primarily on upper body strength to complete the takedown. Sarah used her entire body as a coordinated unit, generating power from her legs and hips in a way that made her feel much stronger than her size would suggest. Once on the ground, Dave found himself dealing with a top pressure that was unlike anything he had experienced in his 2 years of training. Sarah's control was absolute, not through the use of excessive force, but through perfect positioning and timing that made every escape attempt feel futile before it was even fully attempted. By the time the round ended, word was spreading through the academy that something unusual was happening on the grappling mats. Students from other classes began drifting over to watch, drawn by the sight of a woman systematically dominating training partners who were known to be competent grapplers. Brad Kowalski watched the proceedings with growing irritation. He had established himself as one of the academy's rising stars, someone who other students looked up to and sought advice from. The idea that some newcomer, especially a woman, might upend the established hierarchy was unacceptable to him. During the break between rounds, he approached Jimmy with what he tried to make sound like a reasonable suggestion. "Why don't you let me work with the new girl?" he said. "Give her a chance to test herself against someone with a little more experience." Jimmy looked at Brad carefully. He had been teaching long enough to recognize the signs when someone's ego was driving their decision-making, and he could see the tension building in several of his regular students as they watched Sarah's dominant performance. "I don't think that's necessary," Jimmy replied. "She seems to be doing fine with the current progression." But Brad was already walking toward Sarah, his body language broadcasting his intentions to everyone in the room. The atmosphere on the mats suddenly grew tense, with students stopping their own training to watch what was clearly going to be a confrontation rather than a normal sparring session. "Mind if I get around?" Brad asked Sarah, his tone carrying an edge that made it clear this wasn't really a request. The moment Brad committed to his aggressive collar tie, Sarah's tactical mind shifted into the analytical mode that had kept her alive through countless high-stakes operations. She read his intention in the angle of his approach, the distribution of his weight, and the way his muscles tensed as he prepared to use his size advantage. In the space of a heartbeat, she had assessed his strategy and formulated her response. Instead of resisting Brad's forward pressure, Sarah used his own momentum against him. As he lunged forward, she stepped slightly to the side and dropped her level, allowing his weight to carry him past his optimal balance point. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that came from years of training where mistakes had life-or-death consequences, one securing a grip on his lead leg while the other controlled his upper body. The resulting takedown happened so quickly that most of the watching students missed the technical details. One moment Brad was attacking with confidence. The next he was airborne, his body rotating as Sarah used a perfectly executed hip toss to send him crashing onto the mats with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. The sound of Brad hitting the ground echoed through the suddenly quiet training space. Sarah had controlled the takedown enough to avoid seriously injuring him, but there was no doubt about the authority with which it had been executed. This wasn't the result of luck or technique alone. It was the product of someone who understood violence at a level that most recreational martial artists would never reach. Brad found himself on his back, stunned both by the impact and by the speed with which the situation had reversed. Before he could begin to process what had happened, Sarah was already establishing her position on top, her knees driving into his ribs with a pressure that made it difficult for him to expand his chest enough to breathe properly. What followed was 3 minutes of systematic control that demonstrated the difference between someone who had learned grappling as a sport and someone who had been trained to use it as a tool for survival. Sarah's positioning was flawless, her weight distribution calculated to maximize discomfort while maintaining complete control, and her transitions between dominant positions were so smooth that Brad never had even the illusion of escape. Every time he tried to turn onto his stomach to relieve the pressure on his ribs, Sarah adjusted her position to prevent the movement, while simultaneously increasing the uncomfortable nature of his situation. When he attempted to bridge and roll to reverse their positions, she rode the movement effortlessly and used his own energy to transition to an even more controlling position. The watching students gradually fell silent as they realized they were witnessing something far beyond the normal level of technical instruction they were used to seeing. Sarah wasn't just beating Brad. She was demonstrating a level of grappling sophistication that belonged in professional competition, not in a recreational training class. Jimmy watched the round with growing appreciation for Sarah's skill level and growing concern about the implications of what was happening. He had seen enough high-level grapplers to recognize that Sarah's technique was several levels beyond what anyone else in the academy possessed, including himself. More importantly, he could see the way her dominance was affecting the other students' attitudes toward her. Marcus Chun observed the proceedings with the analytical mind of someone who spent his days solving complex problems. What impressed him wasn't just Sarah's technical superiority, but the way she seemed to be operating on a completely different level of tactical awareness. Every movement she made served multiple purposes, controlling Brad's position, preventing his escape attempts, and setting up her next transition all at the same time. Tommy Ricci watched with the eye of someone who had seen real violence and could distinguish between martial arts performance and combat application. What he saw in Sarah's movement patterns was the kind of systematic application of force that spoke to training in environments where the stakes were higher than gym bragging rights. Her control of Brad wasn't just technical. It was the kind of dominance that came from someone who understood how to break an opponent's will to resist. As the round continued, Brad's initial confidence transformed into frustration, then into something approaching panic as he realized that nothing he tried was working. Sarah anticipated every movement he made, countered every technique he attempted, and maintained her control with an ease that suggested she was operating well within her capabilities. The psychological impact of his helplessness began to compound the physical discomfort of his position. Brad had built his identity around his ability to physically dominate opponents through size and strength, and the systematic dismantling of that identity was more demoralizing than any amount of physical pain could have been. When Jimmy finally called time to end the round, Sarah immediately released her control and moved away, giving Brad space to recover. She showed no signs of exertion despite having spent 3 minutes controlling a much larger opponent, and her expression remained neutral despite having just delivered a comprehensive demonstration of superior skill. Brad slowly got to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment, and his breathing labored from the sustained pressure he had endured. The watching students were quiet, uncertain how to process what they had witnessed. The expected narrative, larger male athlete overwhelming smaller female newcomer, had been completely reversed, and the implications of that reversal were still sinking in. "Good round," Sarah said simply, offering Brad a respectful nod before moving to get some water. The gesture was meant to diffuse any lingering tension, but for Brad it felt like salt in the wound. Being beaten was one thing. Being treated graciously by his victor made the defeat feel even more complete. He muttered something that might have been acknowledgement and walked toward the locker rooms, ostensibly to get water, but actually to escape the attention that his defeat had drawn. Jimmy called the class back together for one final round of sparring, but the energy in the room had shifted significantly. Several of the intermediate students who had been eager to test themselves against Sarah suddenly found themselves less enthusiastic about the opportunity. The demonstration they had just witnessed had made it clear that challenging her was likely to result in a similarly one-sided outcome. Dave Martinez, the young Brazilian jiu-jitsu student who had sparred with Sarah earlier, found himself paired with Marcus for the final round. As they began grappling, Dave couldn't help but express his amazement at what they had all witnessed. "Did you see that takedown?" he asked between position changes. "I've been training for 2 years, and I've never seen anything like that." Marcus nodded as he worked to improve his position from bottom guard. "She's obviously had some serious instruction. That wasn't recreational martial arts. That was something else entirely." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tommy Ricci, who had apparently decided that he needed to restore some balance to the situation. Tommy had been watching the proceedings with growing irritation, his military background making it impossible for him to accept that a woman might possess combat skills that exceeded his own. "Mind if I cut in?" Tommy asked, his tone making it clear that this wasn't really a request. Dave looked uncertainly between Tommy and Marcus, recognizing the tension that had suddenly entered the situation. Tommy had a reputation at the academy as someone who took training very seriously and had been known to get carried away during sparring sessions when his ego was involved. "We're almost done with the round," Marcus replied diplomatically, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated. But Tommy was already moving towards Sarah, his body language broadcasting his intentions to everyone in the vicinity. The remaining students stopped their own sparring to watch what was clearly going to be another confrontation, though this one carried a different kind of energy than Brad's challenge had. Where Brad had been motivated primarily by wounded pride and the need to restore his status in the gym's hierarchy, Tommy's motivation ran deeper. His military service had become the foundation of his identity, the source of his self-respect, and his sense of place in the world. The idea that a woman might have served in a capacity that exceeded his own experiences threatened that foundation in ways he couldn't consciously acknowledge. Sarah saw him approaching and immediately understood the nature of the challenge. Tommy's movement patterns, his posture, and the way he held his hands all spoke to someone with legitimate combat training. Unlike Brad, who had relied primarily on size and athletic ability, Tommy would bring tactical knowledge and experience to their encounter. "Got time for one more round?" Tommy asked, his tone carefully neutral despite the intensity visible in his eyes. Sarah studied him for a moment, taking in the details that revealed his background. His stance was that of someone who had been trained to fight in environments where failure meant death rather than just losing points. His hands showed calluses that came from weapons handling rather than just weightlifting. Most tellingly, his eyes held the kind of watchfulness that developed in people who had spent time in places where violence could erupt without warning. "Sure," Sarah replied, recognizing that this confrontation was probably inevitable and preferring to deal with it directly rather than allowing tension to build over time. They moved to the center of the mats, and the remaining students formed a circle around them. Jimmy considered stopping the sparring session, but he could see that the situation had developed its own momentum and would need to play out before the underlying tensions could be resolved. Tommy approached the engagement with more caution than Brad had shown. His military experience had taught him to respect unknown opponents and to gather information before committing to aggressive action. He began with light contact, testing Sarah's reactions and trying to feel out her defensive strategies. Sarah responded with equal caution, recognizing that Tommy's approach was fundamentally different from Brad's straightforward aggression. Where Brad had tried to overwhelm her with size and strength, Tommy was probing for weaknesses and looking for opportunities to exploit superior tactical knowledge. They circled each other for nearly 30 seconds, both looking for openings while trying to avoid giving their opponent any advantages. The technical chess match was fascinating to watch for anyone who understood the subtleties of high-level grappling, but the tension in the room made it clear that this was about much more than martial arts technique. Tommy made the first aggressive move, attempting a single-leg takedown that demonstrated solid technique and good timing. His approach was textbook military combatives, simple, direct, and designed to work against opponents who might be wearing equipment or fighting on uneven terrain. Sarah's response revealed another level of her tactical sophistication. Instead of simply defending the takedown attempt, she used Tommy's commitment to his attack to set up a counter that was both elegant and devastatingly effective. As he drove forward with his takedown attempt, she pivoted on her lead foot and used his own momentum to take him down with a technique that was part wrestling, part judo, and part something that couldn't be easily categorized. The execution was perfect, and Tommy found himself on the ground with Sarah controlling him from a position that was similar to what she had used against Brad, but subtly different in ways that spoke to her ability to adapt her approach based on her opponent's capabilities. What followed was another demonstration of systematic control, but this time against someone who possessed legitimate defensive skills. Tommy's attempts to escape were technically sound and tactically intelligent, but Sarah's responses were always one step ahead of his efforts. She seemed to anticipate his movements before he made them, countering his defensive strategies with adjustments that maintained her control while gradually increasing the pressure he was under. The most impressive aspect of her performance was the way she adapted her technique to account for Tommy's military background. Where civilian grapplers might rely on techniques that required sustained contact and gradual pressure, Sarah's approach was designed to work against someone who had been trained to create space and disengage from unfavorable situations. As the round progressed, it became clear that Tommy's military experience, while legitimate and extensive, had been focused on a different type of combat than what was required in this situation. His training had emphasized quick, violent solutions designed to end fights rapidly in chaotic environments. Sarah's training had included those same elements, but had also encompassed the kind of sustained, technical grappling that was now determining the outcome of their encounter. By the time Jimmy called the end of the round, Tommy had experienced the same systematic dismantling that Brad had endured, though his superior defensive knowledge had allowed him to avoid some of the more uncomfortable positions that his predecessor had been forced to endure. Sarah again released her control immediately when time was called, offering Tommy the same respectful treatment she had given Brad. For Tommy, however, the defeat carried implications that went beyond wounded pride. His entire sense of himself as a warrior had been challenged and found wanting, and the psychological impact of that realization was visible in his expression as he slowly got to his feet. The training session officially ended a few minutes later, but the impact of what had occurred would continue to resonate through the academy for weeks to come. Students gathered in small groups to discuss what they had witnessed, trying to process the implications of seeing two of their most respected training partners systematically dominated by someone they had initially dismissed as a beginner. Sarah gathered her gear and prepared to leave, maintaining the same calm demeanor she had displayed throughout the session. She had been through similar situations enough times to know that the initial shock would gradually give way to acceptance, curiosity, and eventually respect, but she also knew that there would likely be additional challenges before the group dynamic stabilized. As she headed toward the exit, she was intercepted by Jimmy, who had been thinking about the implications of what he had witnessed for his academy and his students. "That was impressive," he said simply. "Mind if I ask what your background is?" Sarah considered her response carefully. She had learned over the years that being too specific about her military service often led to more questions than she was comfortable answering. But she also recognized that some explanation was necessary if she was going to continue training at the academy. "Navy," she replied. "Special operations." Jimmy nodded, the pieces suddenly clicking into place. He had heard rumors about the integration of women into previously all-male special operations units, but this was his first direct encounter with someone from that program. "SEAL?" he asked quietly. Sarah's slight nod confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. "Well," Jimmy said after a moment, "you're welcome here anytime. I think my students could learn a lot from training with someone at your level." As Sarah left the academy and walked toward her car, she reflected on the evenings the rumors spread through the academy faster than wildfire. By the time Sarah returned for her second training session 3 days later, everyone from the casual fitness enthusiasts to the professional fighters had heard some version of what had happened in Jimmy's grappling class. The stories had grown in the telling, with details embellished and implications magnified until Sarah had been transformed from a skilled practitioner into something approaching a mythical figure. She arrived to find the atmosphere in the academy significantly different from her first visit. Where before she had been met with skepticism and dismissive glances, now she was the center of attention in a way that was almost more uncomfortable. Students interrupted their own training to watch her warm up. Conversations stopped when she walked past, and she could feel the weight of expectations that had little to do with her own goals for the session. Mike Rodriguez intercepted her before she could make it to the locker rooms, his expression suggesting that he had been dealing with the fallout from her previous visit all week. "We need to talk," he said, gesturing toward his office. Sarah followed him through the maze of equipment and training areas to a small room overlooking the main training floor. The walls were covered with photographs of successful students, championship belts, and certificates from various martial arts organizations. Mike settled behind a cluttered desk and gestured for Sarah to take the chair across from him. "So," Mike began, "apparently you made quite an impression the other night." Sarah waited for him to continue, recognizing the tone of someone who was trying to work through a complex problem. "Don't get me wrong," Mike continued. "What I saw was impressive. Professional-level technique, perfect control, obvious high-level training. But it's created some problems I need to figure out how to manage." He leaned back in his chair and studied Sarah carefully. "Brad Kowalski called yesterday to cancel his membership. Said he was moving to a different gym because this one had lost its competitive edge. Tommy Ricci hasn't been back since that night, and 3 other intermediate students have asked to be moved to different class times so they don't have to train with you." Sarah nodded, having expected something like this. The integration of highly skilled operators into civilian training environments always created social dynamics that were difficult to navigate. Men who had built their identities around their martial prowess often couldn't handle being systematically outperformed by someone they perceived as fundamentally different from themselves. On the other hand, Mike continued, I've had 6 new students sign up this week specifically because word got out that we have someone with your background training here. And my existing students who aren't letting their egos get in the way are more motivated to train than I've seen them in years. He pulled out a folder and opened it on the desk between them. So here's what I'm thinking. You're obviously several levels above what my regular students are dealing with. What would you say to teaching some seminars? Share some of your knowledge with people who are serious about learning? It would help justify the disruption your presence is causing, and it might give my students a chance to learn from someone who's actually used this stuff in real situations. Sarah considered the proposal. Teaching was something she had done during her military career, training new recruits and sharing knowledge with other special operations personnel. The idea of translating that experience to a civilian audience was intriguing, though it would require careful consideration of what techniques and concepts were appropriate to share. What kind of curriculum were you thinking? She asked. Mike smiled, recognizing that her question indicated interest. Real-world self-defense. Not the sport stuff. Practical techniques for people who might actually find themselves in dangerous situations. Police officers, security personnel, women who want to know how to protect themselves. People who need to know what works when there's no referee and no rules. It was an interesting proposition. Sarah's military training had included extensive instruction in techniques designed for exactly those kinds of scenarios, situations where the goal wasn't to score points or achieve submissions, but to escape, control, or neutralize threats as quickly and efficiently as possible. I'd want to start with basic situational awareness, Sarah said, her mind already working through potential course structures. Most people get into trouble because they don't see problems developing until it's too late to avoid them. Mike nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. And that's the kind of knowledge that most martial arts schools don't even address. They're focused on what to do once you're already fighting, not how to avoid fighting in the first place. They spent the next 20 minutes discussing potential course outlines, target audiences, and scheduling considerations. By the time they finished, Sarah had agreed to teach a monthly seminar series focusing on practical self-defense concepts for serious students and professional personnel. As she left Mike's office, Sarah noticed that the dynamic on the training floor had shifted again. Word of their conversation had apparently spread, and she was no longer being watched with the mixture of curiosity and challenge that had characterized her arrival. Instead, she sensed a different kind of attention, the focused interest of people who recognized they might have access to knowledge they couldn't get anywhere else. She made her way to the area where an advanced Brazilian jiu-jitsu class was beginning, taught by Carlos Mendez, a black belt who had competed at the highest levels of the sport before transitioning to instruction. Carlos was a technical wizard whose understanding of leverage and timing had allowed him to defeat much larger and stronger opponents throughout his competitive career. The famous Sarah Mitchell, Carlos said with a grin as she joined the group of students stretching on the mats. I've been hearing stories about you all week. Some of them are so impressive I'm not sure they're physically possible. Sarah smiled back, appreciating Carlos's directness. I'm sure they've been exaggerated. Well, we'll have a chance to find out, Carlos replied. I've been doing this for 25 years, and I'm always interested in learning from people who've used these techniques outside of the sport context. The class began with technical instruction on a complex sequence of transitions from guard position, and Sarah found herself genuinely challenged by the intricacies of Carlos's teaching. Where her military training had emphasized effectiveness over elegance, Carlos's approach focused on the subtle details that could make the difference between success and failure at the highest levels of competition. What impressed Sarah most was Carlos's ability to break down complex movements into component parts that could be understood and practiced systematically. His explanations were clear and logical, his demonstrations were precise, and his corrections were specific enough to help students understand not just what they were doing wrong, but why the correct version worked better. As the class progressed through the drilling portion, Sarah found herself paired with different students who approached the training with varying levels of intensity and skill. Unlike the previous session where her opponents had been motivated primarily by ego, these students were focused on learning and improvement. Maria Santos, a brown belt who worked as a police officer, brought a practical perspective to the training that Sarah appreciated. Maria had been forced to use her martial arts training in real-world situations several times during her career, and her questions focused on the kinds of adaptations that might be necessary when dealing with suspects who were armed, intoxicated, or desperate. The sport version is beautiful, Maria commented during a break between drilling repetitions. But when you're wearing 30 pounds of gear and trying to control someone who's high on methamphetamines, you need something that works even when the technique isn't perfect. It was exactly the kind of insight that Sarah's military experience had taught her to value. Perfect technique was a luxury that was rarely available in real confrontations, where environmental factors, equipment considerations, and psychological pressure combined to create situations that bore little resemblance to controlled training scenarios. David Park, a software engineer who trained as a way to manage stress and stay in shape, represented the other end of the spectrum. His questions focused on the mental aspects of training: how to maintain focus under pressure, how to overcome the natural hesitation that most people felt when faced with violence, and how to develop the kind of tactical mindset that allowed experienced operators to make good decisions in chaotic situations. "I can drill these techniques perfectly in class," David explained, "but I know that if I was ever in a real situation, I'd probably freeze up or forget everything I've learned." How do you train your mind to work under that kind of pressure? It was a sophisticated question that revealed David's understanding of the gap between technical knowledge and practical application. Sarah's training had included extensive work on exactly those psychological factors, using stress inoculation and scenario-based exercises to prepare operators for the mental challenges they would face in actual combat. When the drilling portion of the class ended, Carlos called for light sparring to practice the techniques they had been working on. The atmosphere was completely different from Sarah's previous training session, competitive without being aggressive, focused on learning rather than winning, and characterized by the kind of mutual respect that marked truly advanced practitioners. Sarah found herself paired with Carlos for the first round, and the experience was unlike anything she had encountered in a civilian training environment. Where her previous opponents had relied primarily on strength, aggression, or basic technique, Carlos brought 2.5 decades of refinement to every movement he made. His defense was anticipatory rather than reactive. His transitions were so smooth they seemed effortless, and his understanding of timing and distance allowed him to create opportunities that weren't apparent to less experienced observers. Most impressively, he managed to challenge Sarah's technique without ever making her feel like she was in danger or that he was trying to prove anything at his expense. "You're very strong," Carlos commented as they reset after a particularly complex exchange, "but your strength is different from what I'm used to feeling. It's more integrated, if that makes sense. Like you've trained your entire body to work as a single unit." Sarah nodded, understanding what he was observing. Military training emphasized functional strength over the kind of isolated muscle development that characterized most fitness programs. Every exercise was designed to improve performance in real-world tasks that required coordination, balance, and endurance rather than just the ability to move heavy weights through specific ranges of motion. The round continued with both of them working at a high level of intensity without crossing the line into actual competition. Sarah found herself learning things about leverage and timing that her military instructors had never covered. While Carlos was clearly fascinated by the practical applications of techniques he had only considered in sporting contexts. When the round ended, they were both breathing hard despite the controlled nature of their sparring. The watching students had been treated to a demonstration of what high-level martial arts actually looked like when practiced by people who understood both the technical and tactical aspects of combat. "That was educational," Carlos said with genuine respect. "We should do this again sometime when we have more time to explore some of these concepts." The second round paired Sarah with Maria Santos, and the dynamic shifted toward the kind of scenario-based training that both women had experience with in their professional contexts. Maria brought specific questions about techniques that could be used while wearing police equipment, and Sarah shared insights about maintaining effectiveness when carrying military gear. Their sparring session gradually evolved into a problem-solving exercise as they worked through hypothetical situations that might occur in real-world environments. What if the suspect was larger and stronger? What if they were in a confined space like a car or hallway? What if there were multiple opponents or innocent bystanders to consider? The questions forced both women to think beyond the controlled environment of the training mats and consider the environmental, legal, and tactical factors that would influence their decisions in actual confrontations. It was exactly the kind of cross-training between military and civilian law enforcement that could benefit both sides, sharing knowledge and perspectives that neither group typically had access to. As the class wound down, Sarah realized that she had found something she hadn't expected, a training environment where her skills were respected rather than resented, where her experience was seen as a resource rather than a threat, and where the other students were motivated by genuine desire for improvement rather than ego-driven competition. Carlos approached her as the students began gathering their gear and preparing to leave. "Mike mentioned you might be interested in teaching some seminars," he said. "I'd like to propose something a little different. What would you think about co-teaching some sessions? Your practical experience combined with my sport background might give students a more complete picture of how these techniques work in different contexts." It was an intriguing proposition. Sarah's military experience had taught her that 3 weeks into her training routine at Elite Combat Training Academy, Sarah had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Her seminars with Carlos had begun, drawing students from multiple gyms across San Diego who were interested in learning practical applications of martial arts techniques. The initial skepticism and hostility she had encountered from some students had largely been replaced by professional respect and genuine curiosity about her experience and knowledge. The morning of the incident started no differently from any other training day. Sarah arrived at the academy during the mid-morning lull when most of the serious athletes came to train without the distractions of crowded classes and casual students. The facility was nearly empty except for a few dedicated practitioners working on individual technique and conditioning. She was halfway through her warm-up routine when she noticed the group of men who had entered through the front door. There were 4 of them, all young and athletic, moving with the kind of aggressive confidence that immediately set her instincts on alert. They weren't dressed for training. Their street clothes and the way they carried themselves suggested they weren't here for instruction. Mike Rodriguez emerged from his office, apparently having been summoned by whoever was working the front desk. Sarah could see the conversation from across the training floor, though she couldn't hear the specific words being exchanged. Mike's body language became increasingly tense as the discussion continued, and when he glanced in her direction, Sarah understood that whatever was happening was somehow connected to her. The leader of the group was a heavily muscled man in his late 20s with close-cropped hair and the kind of bearing that suggested military background. He was pointing towards Sarah while speaking to Mike, his voice gradually rising until fragments of the conversation began to carry across the training space. "Just want to see what all the fuss is about. Heard she thinks she's some kind of badass. Show her what real training looks like." Sarah continued her warm-up routine while keeping the group in her peripheral vision. She had encountered similar situations before, men who felt that her reputation somehow diminished their own status, and who believed that challenging her was the only way to restore their sense of masculine superiority. Mike was clearly trying to defuse the situation, his hands raised in a calming gesture as he spoke in lower tones that she couldn't make out. But the group's body language was becoming more aggressive, and Sarah could see that they weren't going to be satisfied with explanations or requests to leave. The confrontation escalated quickly. The leader of the group pushed past Mike and began walking toward Sarah, his 3 companions following behind him in a formation that was clearly designed to intimidate. Their approach was aggressive and purposeful, leaving no doubt about their intentions. "You, Sarah Mitchell," the leader called out as they approached. His tone was challenging, and his positioning indicated that he was preparing for some kind of physical confrontation. Sarah stood up slowly, her mind automatically shifting into tactical assessment mode. For opponents, all larger than her, all moving with coordination that suggested they had worked together before, The academy's layout provided limited escape routes, and the presence of other students in the facility meant that any confrontation would need to be controlled carefully to avoid innocent people getting hurt. Yes, she replied simply, her voice calm despite the obvious threat developing in front of her. I'm Derek Walsh, the leader announced, as if his name should mean something to her. Marine Corps, Force Recon. These are my boys, all Marines, all combat veterans. We heard you've been making quite a name for yourself around here. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Derek and his companions were part of a subculture of former military personnel who had built their post-service identities around their warrior status and who felt threatened by anyone whose accomplishments might overshadow their own. They weren't here for training or legitimate competition. They were here to prove a point about their own superiority. Is there something I can help you with? Sarah asked, maintaining her calm demeanor while subtly adjusting her position to give herself better options if the situation escalated to violence. Derek smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. We thought we'd give you a chance to test yourself against some real operators. See how your Navy training stacks up against Marines who've actually been in the fight. The challenge was clear, and Sarah could see that the group had no intention of accepting any response other than agreement to spar. Mike was approaching from behind them, clearly preparing to intervene, but Sarah knew that his involvement would only make the situation more complex and potentially more dangerous. I'm just here to train, Sarah replied. Not looking for any trouble. Derek's expression hardened. Nobody's talking about trouble, just some friendly sparring between professionals. Unless you're not as tough as everyone says you are. It was a classic manipulation tactic. Frame the challenge in terms that made refusal seem like cowardice while ignoring the obvious fact that this wasn't about training or professional development. Sarah had seen the same approach used countless times by people who wanted to provoke confrontations while maintaining plausible deniability about their true motivations. The situation was complicated by the presence of other students in the facility. Carlos was working with 2 of his regular students on the far side of the training area, and there were 3 other people using various pieces of equipment scattered throughout the space. Any physical confrontation would put innocent people at risk and could result in serious injuries or legal complications. Look, Sarah said, making one final attempt at de-escalation. This isn't the time or place for this kind of thing. If you want to arrange something formal through Mike, we can talk about it. But right now I'm just trying to get a workout in. Derek's response made it clear that peaceful resolution wasn't an option. He stepped closer to Sarah, moving well inside her personal space in a way that was clearly intended to provoke a reaction. His companions spread out slightly, positioning themselves to prevent her from simply walking away from the confrontation. I don't think you understand, Derek said, his voice dropping to a lower, more threatening tone. We didn't come here to ask permission. We came here to see what you're made of. And we're not leaving until we get some answers. The threat was now explicit, and Sarah could see that the group was prepared to use physical force to get what they wanted. Mike had reached them and was trying to insert himself between Derek and Sarah, but Derek's companions were clearly prepared to prevent any interference with their leader's plans. Gentlemen, you need to leave, Mike said firmly. This is a private facility, and you're not welcome here. One of Derek's companions, a stocky man with a shaved head and multiple tattoos covering his arms, stepped forward to face Mike. Stay out of this, old man. This is between professionals. The casual dismissal and veiled threat toward Mike crystallized Sarah's decision-making process. These men weren't going to be reasoned with or discouraged by appeals to common sense. They had come here specifically to provoke a confrontation, and they were prepared to escalate the situation until they got what they wanted, regardless of who else might be hurt in the process. Sarah's tactical analysis was complete within seconds. For opponents, coordinated but overconfident. They were expecting her to be intimidated by their numbers and aggressive posture, which meant they would be unprepared for a sudden shift from defensive to offensive action. The Academy's layout provided opportunities for using environmental factors to her advantage, and her superior technical knowledge could be leveraged to even the odds quickly. Most importantly, she recognized that allowing the situation to continue would only put more people at risk. Derek and his companions had already demonstrated that they weren't concerned about collateral damage or consequences, and Their behavior would only become more unpredictable if they didn't get the confrontation they were seeking. "All right," Sarah said quietly, her tone remaining calm despite the decision she had made. "Let's get this over with." Derek's smile returned, though there was something predatory in his expression now. "Now you're talking. We'll keep it simple, one-on-one, submission or knockout. My boys will make sure it stays fair." Sarah almost laughed at the transparent dishonesty of the proposal. There was nothing fair about the situation Derek was creating, and his definition of fair would undoubtedly change the moment things didn't go according to his plan. But she also knew that agreeing to the facade might give her opportunities that outright refusal wouldn't provide. "Fine," she replied. "But we do this properly. Clear the area, set some boundaries, make sure nobody else gets hurt." Derek nodded, apparently satisfied that he had gotten what he wanted. He gestured to his companions, who began moving other students and equipment away from the central training area. Mike started to protest, but Sarah caught his eye and shook her head slightly, indicating that she wanted him to let the situation play out. As the space was being cleared, Sarah continued her mental preparation for what was about to occur. Derek was larger and stronger than she was, probably outweighing her by 60 or 70 pounds. His Marine Corps background meant he had legitimate combat training, and his confidence suggested he had been successful in previous confrontations. But Sarah also noted details that Derek probably wasn't aware of revealing about himself. His stance favored his right side, suggesting an old injury or habitual preference that could be exploited. His positioning indicated someone who relied primarily on forward pressure and strength rather than technical finesse. Most importantly, his aggressive demeanor suggested someone who had been accustomed to winning through intimidation and force rather than tactical sophistication. The cleared area was roughly 20 feet by 20 feet, large enough to allow movement but small enough that Derek's size advantages would remain relevant. Mike had retreated to a safe distance, but was clearly prepared to intervene if the situation got out of control. Carlos and his students had stopped their own training to watch, their expressions ranging from concern to fascination. Derek removed his shirt, revealing a muscular physique that spoke to years of dedicated physical conditioning. His body bore several scars that suggested he had indeed seen combat, and his movements demonstrated the kind of functional fitness that came from military training rather than just gym workouts. Sarah remained in her training clothes, making no dramatic gestures or attempts to psychologically intimidate her opponent. She had learned long ago that real confidence didn't need to be displayed, it simply was. Her preparation was internal and mental, running through tactical options and contingency plans for various ways the confrontation might develop. Derek approached the center of the cleared area with the swagger of someone who was certain of the outcome. His body language broadcast his expectation that this would be a quick and decisive demonstration of masculine superiority over feminine pretension. The moment Derek committed to his attack, Sarah's world slowed down in the way it always did when her training took over completely. Years of preparation under the most extreme conditions had programmed her nervous system to respond to threats with a level of precision and violence that few people could comprehend, let alone defend against. Derek came forward with the kind of aggressive rush that had probably worked well for him in bar fights and gym confrontations with less skilled opponents. His approach was straightforward. Use his size and strength to overwhelm his opponent before they could establish any kind of defensive strategy. It was the tactical equivalent of bringing a club to a chess match. Sarah's response was immediate and devastating. Instead of trying to meet Derek's forward pressure directly, she moved laterally and used his own momentum against him. Her footwork was perfect, creating an angle that put her outside his primary line of attack, while positioning her to counter with techniques he had never encountered in any military training program. The first technique she used was a modified hip toss that incorporated elements from multiple martial arts disciplines, adapted through years of real-world application to work against larger, stronger opponents who were wearing equipment or fighting in confined spaces. Derek found himself airborne before his brain could process what had happened, his body rotating through space with a violence that drove all the air from his lungs when he impacted the mat. But Sarah wasn't finished. The moment Derek hit the ground, she was already transitioning to a control position that was designed not for sport competition but for real-world application where the goal was to neutralize threats as quickly and completely as possible. Her knee drove into his solar plexus with enough force to paralyze his diaphragm, while her hands controlled his arms in a way that prevented any effective resistance. Derek's confidence evaporated in the space between one heartbeat and the next, replaced by the very real understanding that he was in serious danger. This wasn't the kind of martial arts sparring he had expected. This was something else entirely, a level of technical violence that belonged on battlefields rather than in training facilities. Sarah's positioning was perfect, her weight distribution calculated to maximize his discomfort while maintaining complete control over his ability to move or breathe effectively. Every time Derek tried to adjust his position to relieve the pressure, Sarah's counter-adjustments were so immediate and precise that he felt like he was fighting against a machine designed specifically to defeat human resistance. The watching students had fallen completely silent, their expressions ranging from fascination to horror as they witnessed a level of martial arts application that none of them had imagined was possible. This wasn't sport grappling or recreational martial arts. This was a demonstration of how combat techniques were actually supposed to work when applied by someone who understood their true purpose. Derek's three companions had been watching with the same confidence their leader had displayed, certain that numbers would guarantee their preferred outcome regardless of how the individual confrontation developed. But, as they saw Derek systematically dismantled by someone half his size, their certainty began to waver. The stocky man with the tattoos was the first to move, apparently deciding that the agreed-upon rules no longer applied now that his leader was losing. He stepped forward with the obvious intention of intervening in the confrontation, his expression making it clear that he was prepared to use whatever force was necessary to restore the situation to their advantage. Sarah saw him coming in her peripheral vision and made a tactical decision that would be talked about in the academy for years afterward. Without releasing her control over Derek, she shifted her position slightly to prepare for the multiple opponent scenario that was developing. When the tattooed man came within range, Sarah exploded into action with a level of speed and precision that defied belief. Her left hand shot out in a strike that caught him in the solar plexus with enough force to double him over, while her right hand maintained control over Derek to prevent him from taking advantage of her momentary distraction. The strike was perfectly placed and timed, designed to disable rather than cause permanent damage, but delivered with enough authority to make it clear that she could have chosen a more devastating option if the situation had required it. The tattooed man collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, and completely out of the fight. The two remaining members of Derek's group exchanged glances, suddenly, uncertain about whether they wanted to continue with their original plan. They had expected to watch their leader dominate a woman who had gotten lucky against some gym rats. Instead, they were watching two of their number get systematically dismantled by someone who was operating on a completely different level than anything they had encountered. Sarah's voice cut through the tension in the room, calm and controlled despite the violence she had just demonstrated. Anyone else want to test their training? The question hung in the air, and the remaining two men found themselves facing a decision they hadn't expected to have to make. Their tactical situation had deteriorated rapidly from a position of overwhelming superiority to one where continuing the confrontation would likely result in their own humiliation and possible injury. Derek was still struggling to breathe under Sarah's control, his face red from exertion and oxygen deprivation. Every attempt he made to escape only resulted in increased pressure and discomfort as Sarah adjusted her position with the kind of technical precision that spoke to thousands of hours of practice against fully resisting opponents. "I can't breathe," Derek gasped, his voice barely audible. Sarah's response was immediate but measured. She adjusted her position slightly, relieving enough pressure to allow Derek to breathe, while maintaining complete control over his ability to continue fighting. The gesture demonstrated both her technical skill and her restraint. She could have easily rendered him unconscious or caused serious injury, but she chose to maintain control without escalating to that level of violence. "Are we done here?" Sarah asked, her tone making it clear that the question was directed at all four men, not just the one she was controlling. The two standing members of Derek's group nodded quickly, their eagerness to end the confrontation obvious to everyone in the room. They moved to help their tattooed companion to his feet, supporting him as he struggled to regain his breathing and composure. Sarah maintained her control over Derek for another moment, ensuring that he understood the completeness of his defeat before finally releasing him and moving back to a safe distance. Derek slowly rolled onto his side, coughing and gasping as his respiratory system gradually returned to normal function. The silence in the academy was profound, broken only by the sounds of Derek and his companion recovering from their encounters with Sarah's technical expertise. The other students who had witnessed the confrontation stood frozen, processing what they had seen and trying to understand the implications of the demonstration they had just witnessed. Mike Rodriguez was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying an authority that made it clear he was reasserting control over his facility. "I think it's time for you gentlemen to leave," he said, addressing Derek's group. "And don't come back. You're not welcome here anymore." Derek slowly got to his feet, his expression a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been respect. His confident swagger was completely gone, replaced by the careful movements of someone who had just learned that their understanding of their own capabilities had been seriously flawed. "This isn't over," he muttered as he gathered his shirt and prepared to leave. Sarah's response was quiet, but carried clearly through the silent training space. "Yes, it is." The finality in her tone was unmistakable, and Derek's remaining defiance crumbled in the face of it. He had been given a comprehensive demonstration of the difference between recreational martial arts and real combat expertise, and any thoughts of future confrontation died in the face of that understanding. Derek's group made their way toward the exit, their body language completely different from the aggressive confidence they had displayed when they arrived. The tattooed man was still moving carefully, one hand pressed to his solar plexus, while the other two supported him and kept their eyes fixed on the floor. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the academy gradually began to dissipate. The students who had witnessed the confrontation slowly returned to their training, though their conversations were subdued, and their glances towards Sarah were filled with a new kind of respect. Carlos approached Sarah as she began gathering her gear, his expression thoughtful and slightly odd. He began, then paused as he searched for words adequate to describe what he had witnessed. "I've been doing this for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like that. The way you controlled both of them simultaneously, the precision of that strike, the tactical awareness to handle multiple opponents. Where did you learn to do that?" Sarah's response was characteristically modest. "Good training, lots of practice." But Carlos wasn't satisfied with the simple answer. As a high-level martial artist himself, he could recognize the kind of technical sophistication that required more than just good instruction and dedicated practice. What he had witnessed was the result of training under conditions that most people would never experience, with stakes that went far beyond winning or losing a sporting competition. "The military doesn't teach that level of technical sophistication," Carlos pressed. "That was something else entirely. Special operations." Sarah nodded, recognizing that the demonstration had revealed more about her background than she typically preferred to share. "Navy SEALs. 8 years." The confirmation sent a ripple of understanding through the students who were close enough to hear the conversation. Suddenly, the rumors and stories that had been circulating about Sarah's background were placed in a context that made sense of what they had just witnessed. Mike Rodriguez joined the conversation, his relief at having the confrontation ended without serious injury mixing with his amazement at Sarah's performance. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I should have thrown those guys out the moment they walked in here. I know their type. They were looking for trouble, and they weren't going to leave until they found it." Sarah shrugged off the apology. "You handled it fine. Sometimes these situations just have to play out." But Mike wasn't finished. "What you did here today, that was something special. You protected my facility, my students, and probably those idiots from themselves. They had no idea what they were getting into." The incident had revealed several important things to everyone who had witnessed it. First, Sarah's reputation hadn't been exaggerated. If anything, the stories that had been circulating had understated her actual capabilities. Second, her restraint and control were as impressive as her technical skills. She had neutralized 2 opponents without causing permanent injury, despite having the capability to do much more serious damage. Third, her tactical awareness and ability to handle multiple opponents simultaneously was evidence of training and experience that went far beyond what most martial artists would ever encounter. As Sarah finished gathering her gear and prepared to leave, she was approached by Maria Santos, the police officer who had been training with Carlos's group. Maria's expression was a mixture of professional interest and personal admiration. "I've been in law enforcement for 12 years, Maria said quietly, "and I've never seen anything like what you just did. The way you controlled that situation, managed multiple threats, used exactly the right amount of force. That's exactly what we train for. But I've never seen it executed at that level." Sarah appreciated Maria's perspective, recognizing that police work provided one of the few civilian contexts where tactical skills were applied under real-world pressure. "Different training, same principles," Sarah replied. "Situational awareness, threat assessment, controlled application of force." Maria nodded, understanding the parallels between their respective experiences. "Would you be willing to do some training with our department? We have defensive tactics instructors, but they've never worked with someone with your background. I think our officers could learn a lot from your approach." It was an interesting proposition, and one that appealed to Sarah's sense of service and duty. Police officers faced many of the same tactical challenges that military personnel encountered, but they operated under different legal and ethical constraints that required sophisticated judgment and technical skill. "I'd be interested in discussing that," Sarah replied. Training exchange could benefit both sides. As Sarah left the academy that afternoon, she reflected on how dramatically the situation had evolved from her first visit. She had arrived as an unknown quantity, faced initial skepticism and challenges from students who questioned her presence, proved her abilities through demonstration rather than argument, and, finally, been forced to apply those abilities to protect herself and others from people who had come looking for trouble. The incident with Derek and his companions had been unfortunate, but probably inevitable. Her reputation had attracted attention from people who saw her success as a threat to their own status and self-image, and confrontations with such individuals were an occupational hazard that came with being a woman in environments traditionally dominated by men focused on proving their toughness. What was more significant was the response of the academy's legitimate students and instructors. Instead of being intimidated or resentful of her capabilities, they had shown genuine appreciation for her skills and interest in learning from her experience. The invitations to teach seminars, collaborate with other instructors, and provide training to law enforcement represented exactly the kind of knowledge sharing that made her military service worthwhile. Sarah had learned early in her career that expertise carried with it an obligation to share knowledge with others who could benefit from it. The confrontation with Derek's group had been an unfortunate necessity, but the broader relationships she was building within the San Diego training community represented the real value of her presence at the academy. As she drove home, Sarah's thoughts turned to the seminars she would be teaching, the collaborations she was planning with Carlos and other instructors, and the potential training opportunities with local law enforcement. Her shore leave was supposed to be a period of rest and recovery, but it was becoming something much more valuable, an opportunity to bridge the gap between military and civilian training communities, sharing hard-won knowledge and learning from perspectives she wouldn't encounter in purely military environments. The incident at the academy would be talked about for months, becoming part of the local martial arts folklore and cementing Sarah's reputation as someone whose capabilities matched her credentials. But for Sarah herself, it was just another step in a continuing journey of service, learning, and the pursuit of excellence that had defined her entire career. The real story wasn't about the confrontation itself, but about what came after, the relationships built, the knowledge shared, and the community strengthened through the presence of someone whose dedication to her craft had taken her to levels that few would ever reach. "Ready to see what real combat training looks like?" he called out, loud enough for everyone in the facility to hear. Sarah simply nodded and moved toward the center of the space, her expression calm and focused. She had been in far more dangerous situations than this one, facing opponents who were better trained, better equipped, and more motivated than Derek could possibly be. This was just another problem to be solved efficiently and professionally. They faced each other in the center of the cleared area, and Derek's confidence was palpable. He had size, strength, legitimate military training, and numerical superiority through his companions who were clearly prepared to ensure the outcome went his way regardless of what rules had been agreed upon. What Derek didn't have was an accurate assessment of his opponent's capabilities or an understanding of the tactical principles that would determine the outcome of their encounter. He was about to discover that reputation and swagger were poor substitutes for real expertise when facing someone who had been trained to a level that few people would ever experience. The confrontation was about to begin, and Sarah was ready to demonstrate exactly why her reputation had spread so quickly through the San Diego martial arts community. The most effective training programs combined different perspectives and skill sets, and Carlos's approach to instruction was sophisticated enough that collaboration could produce something more valuable than either of them could create independently. "What kind of format were you thinking?" Sarah asked. Carlos smiled, his mind clearly already working through the possibilities. "Monthly workshops, maybe 3 hours each. I handle the technical fundamentals, you cover the practical applications. We bring in scenario training, stress inoculation, decision-making under pressure. Give people a chance to understand not just what to do, but when and why to do it." The proposal represented exactly the kind of knowledge sharing that Sarah had hoped to find in the civilian training community. Too often, martial arts instruction focused on technique in isolation, without addressing the tactical, psychological, and environmental factors that determined whether those techniques would be effective in real situations. As she drove home that evening, Sarah reflected on how much the dynamic had changed from her first visit to the academy. The initial challenges and confrontations had given way to opportunities for mutual learning and skill development, exactly the kind of progression she had experienced many times during her military career. What she didn't realize was that her success in earning the respect of the academy's serious students had attracted attention from outside the gym, and that her next challenge would come from a source she wasn't expecting: events. The initial challenges were always the most difficult part of integrating into a new training environment. But once people understood her capabilities, the dynamic usually shifted toward mutual respect and productive training partnerships. What she didn't realize as she drove home was that the events of this first night had set in motion a chain of consequences